I cannot be silent.
Back when Eisenhower was the president, golf courses is where most of his time was spent. So I never really listened to what the president said, because in general I believed that the general was politically dead. But he always seemed to know when the muscles were about to be flexed, because I remember him saying something, mumbling something about a military-industrial complex.
As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our home nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent.
Each one reach one, each one time.
I cannot be silent.
Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everyone must play a part. Everyone's got to go to work. Work for peace. Spirit say work.
I cannot be silent.
Empowering the body, mind, and spirit. This is We Cannot Be Silent with Phil Restino and Larry Pinkney.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the December 16, 2013 edition of We Cannot Be Silent with Phil Restino and Larry Pinkney. And once again, we're broadcasting on the Wolf Spirit Radio Network, and that's wolfspiritradio.com. And tonight we have a very special guest, and we were hoping to get this fellow on because we did want to talk about the 100th anniversary of the creation of the privately owned central bank known as the Federal Reserve. And the guest we have tonight, many of you are probably familiar with already. It's peace activist and talk show host Michael Rivero. And for those of you who are familiar with Mike, or perhaps you're familiar with the really powerful piece he did early in the year entitled "All Wars Are Bankers' Wars," and if you go to Mike's website, whatreallyhappened.com, and in the search button just type "All Wars Are Bankers' Wars," and initially it was a piece he had written and then discussed on the show, and then they went ahead and made a YouTube video out of it, and it's been going around like crazy. And I think it's even available as a DVD with Ron Klein, I believe his name is, who does the $1DVDproject.com. So please get a hold of this video and the link to All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, and get it around to folks. But let's tell you a little bit about our guest. Michael Rivero is the webmaster of whatreallyhappened.com and host of the What Really Happened radio shows on the Republic Broadcasting Network. The whatreallyhappened.com website is now in its 19th year, and I think he's closing in on 20 years, actually. Formerly with NASA, Michael transitioned his image processing skills into the then new motion picture computer animation field, and has worked on films such as Star Trek, The Day After Tomorrow, and has supervised visual effects on Brainscan, Lost, and Hawaii Five-0. Michael has taken a sabbatical from film work to focus all his efforts on peace activism. Michael's foray into blogging began before the word was even invented, and happened almost by accident when he spotted a suspicious photograph being broadcast on ABC News in 1994 related to the death of White House Deputy Counsel Vincent Foster. Since that sudden beginning, Michael's website has expanded to cover diverse topics including the JFK assassination, the accidental shoot-down of TWA 800, election fraud, health issues, Saddam's non-existent nuclear weapons, 9/11, the economy, and of course the lies used to trick the United States into wars of conquest on Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Iran. Michael resides in Hawaii with his wife Claire, who is a composer and creates much of theme music used on the What Really Happened radio show. And if I heard correctly on today's broadcast of Mike's show, that music has been compiled onto a audio CD that may be available for those who inquire. With that, I want to welcome everybody. I want to welcome Michael Rivero to the show. Michael, are you with us?
Yes, I am, and that was a very glorious introduction and recap of my history out there. And the music that my wife wrote, it's a Christmas album. She originally did it as a charity for Doctors Without Borders. The album is Christmas Without Borders, and during the holiday season we play clips from it for bumper music. And right now, to help people find the will to donate to RVN, because we're in our end of the year fundraiser. If you donate over $100, in addition to the T-shirt and mug, if you leave your address, we will mail you an autographed CD of Claire's Christmas Without Borders.
Oh, that's great. And the music I heard today on your program, it really sounded nice, and there's power in music. And I'd also like to, at this point in time, Michael, introduce to you and our audience the co-host of our show, Larry Pinkney. And those who have followed us in the past know Larry. Larry has been an activist for pretty much his adult life, and going back to the 1960s. He was a member of the original Black Panther Party, and got involved with it out in California. And as you know, the Black Panther Party was targeted by the government, COINTELPRO, and Larry's number came up at sooner down the road, and he was set up and put in jail and was a political prisoner for 10 years. And after getting out of prison, well, actually, while in prison, he did his writings, and he continued writing ever since. And Larry's currently writing for IntrepidReport.com, and his latest article that came out last week really took some shots at well-deserved shots at the phony left anti-war movement and progressive movement that's basically been providing left cover for everything that the Democrat Obama has been able to get away with the last 5 years. So Larry does have a website of his own. It's Black Activist Writers Guild, and that's blackactivistwg.org. And at this point in time, we'd like to bring Larry into the conversation to say hello. Larry, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. I want to welcome our guest, Mike Rivero. Mike, it's great to have you on. I don't intend to be saying very much. Phil, you've pretty much given my background. I will add that I am the only American, quote-unquote American, to have ever successfully self-authored, operative term, self-authored my civil, political, and human rights case to the United Nations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. With that having been said, don't think we really need to spend time on me or us. Let's get to our guests. Welcome, Mike. Back to you, Phil.
Okay, great, Larry. And, well, as I mentioned, our guest is Michael Rivero of WhatReallyHappened.com, and a piece that I can't recommend enough. All wars are bankers' wars, and get a hold of it and share it with others. But that's why we have Mike on tonight to talk about what he knows about all these wars and how they're bankers' wars and how this all connects. We have the military-industrial complex, put the Congress in there too, and we have all that, but we really have to follow the money, and so I was hoping, Michael, at this point in time, you can tell us a little bit more about yourself, if for the things that we missed in the introduction, and then maybe bring us into all wars are bankers' wars.
Well, thank you very much here. And before I get into that, of course, Larry, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm deeply aware of the very underhanded methods used by the FBI to, first of all, demonize the original Black Panthers, and intentionally drive them toward militant behavior that could be used to demonize them in the media. Definitely a huge part of COINTELPRO, and I'm absolutely delighted to meet you, and I hope we'll maintain communication after tonight's interview. To get back to the All Wars are Bankers' Wars, it is basically a retelling of U.S. history from the point of view of the agenda of private central banking, and it all goes back to when this country was still a colony of Great Britain. And it begins with Benjamin Franklin, who was appointed, a representative of the colonies to the court of St. James, to King George III, before the Revolution. And while Ben Franklin was in London, he got to see the horrible poverty of the ordinary people. And if you've read the works of Charles Dickens, you're very familiar with that. The conditions in Whitechapel, the Ripper. All of these are an artifact of the way the Bank of England ran the economy, which was that all commerce had to be conducted using these paper banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. And it made the Bank of England and their owners incredibly rich, and it inevitably drew the value of the work product away from the people and resulted in incredible unemployment, hunger, and starvation. And Ben Franklin was quite frankly shocked at all of this. And when he was visiting the court of King George III, all the courtiers were saying, well, over in the colonies, what do you do with your unemployed and hungry? And Ben Franklin said, we don't have any. And they said, what? He said, well, we're basically, we're printing our own currency. The government creates it, spends it into circulation to buy what the government needs. It flows through commerce to make commerce easy, and then it's taxed back by the same amount at the end of the cycle to balance the books and close everything, and it works really well. There is ample money in circulation to guarantee maximum employment and economic activity. And everybody started saying, this sounds like a really good idea. So, of course, over at the Bank of England, they were not at all happy about this revelation. So they lobbied King George III to pass the Currency Act, which ordered all the American colonies to stop using their own currencies and from that point forward conduct all commerce and pay all taxes only using banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. And it only took a few years for this system to drive the American colonies down into the same poverty and unemployment and difficulty that we were seeing in the British subjects of the same time. Now, if you went to public school, you were probably taught that the American Revolution was all about the tea tax and the Stamp Act and impressment and all these other situations. But if you go back and read the writings of Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers, they make it very clear. It was the Currency Act that enslaved the people to this private bank in England, the Bank of England, that led to the war. In fact, here is a direct quote from Benjamin Franklin. Quote, "The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the revolution." So the revolution came and went. The United States became an independent nation, and the first thing they did was they set up a treasury that operated on the same system that had made the colonies prosperous. The government created all the currency, put it into circulation without accruing interest, and taxed it back by the same amount at the end of the cycle to balance the books. And it worked very well, and the American colonies were prospering to a degree that Britain could not compete with. So the private central bankers, the promoters of that, came in and basically wanted to restart the same scam all over again. And they started with the First Bank of the United States. Now, the First Bank of the United States didn't issue all of the U.S. currency at interest because that was still the province of the government, but they were chartered to issue banknotes at interest. And after a very short time, the same poverty, unemployment was happening. So in 1811, when the original 20-year charter of the First Bank of the United States was set to expire, Congress voted not to renew the charter. And the head of the Rothschild banking clan, Nathan Rothschild, literally issued a threat against the United States government. Either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself in a most disastrous war. Congress still refused to renew the charter for the First Bank of the United States, and the Rothschild banks, which included obviously the Bank of England, went to King George III and said, if you want to recolonize the United States, bring them back into colonial status, we will loan you the money to do the war almost at its interest. And that was where we got the War of 1812. Now, the United States succeeded in winning the War of 1812, but it bankrupted the United States to the point where they were basically forced into granting a charter for the Second Bank of the United States, and that had a 20-year charter. And at the end of that 20 years, once again, the bankers were getting rich off the labor of ordinary people by this simple mechanism of you borrow all currency that you use from us at interest. And so Andrew Jackson ran his second campaign for the White House on the motto, Jackson and no bank. And true to his word, Andrew Jackson blocked renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. He is also, not coincidentally, the only president to ever pay off the national debt. And almost as soon as he had shut down the Second Bank of the United States of America, there was an attempt on his life by an assassin who said, hey, with Jackson dead, money would be more plentiful. So it was obviously a financial motive behind all of that. So, and this keeps on going back. There's this wonderful, wonderful quote by Andrew Jackson when he explains why he's shutting down the Second Bank of the United States. He says, gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I've had men watching you for a long time, and am convinced that you have used the funds of the banks to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you. When you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families. That would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves. I've determined to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. And that was how strongly he felt about it. Now, the Second Bank of the United States, after they lost their charter to issue banknotes, they tried to operate briefly as a regular bank and almost immediately went out of business. So the private central banks don't operate as regular banks. They don't even really know how. Other presidents tried to prevent the creation of private central banks. Zachary Taylor opposed the creation of a new private central bank. He was apparently poisoned with a bowl of cherries. President James Buchanan also opposed a private central bank, and during the Panic of 1857, he tried to set limits on banks issuing more loans than they had actual funds. They're trying to get rid of this whole fractional reserve idea, and he was poisoned with arsenic. Now, he survived, but 38 of the other people at that same dinner died. Okay, so I mean, it just goes on. Now, when the Confederacy seceded from the United States, the bankers once again saw the opportunity for a rich harvest of debt and offered to fund Lincoln's effort to reunite the Union at a 30% interest rate. Lincoln said he was not going to free the black man by enslaving the white man to the bankers, and under his authority as president, issued a new government currency, the greenback. This was a direct threat to the wealth and power of the private central banks. And there was an interesting quote that was written in the European press. And the quote is, "If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." This was in the London Times, responding to greenbacks. Okay? And because of this, the European banking clans all supported the Confederacy. Huge amounts of money and arms and supplies on the condition that if the Confederacy defeated the Union, the greenback would be destroyed, and the Confederacy said, yes, we will allow private central banking. That's how important this was to them. And believe it or not, France and Britain seriously considered invading the Union, and they were held at bay. Little bit of history most people don't realize. Russia stepped in to prevent Britain and France from invading the Union and winning the war on behalf of the Confederacy, because Russia had just gone through their financial revolution. The Tsar had kicked out their private central banks. He was experimenting with government-issued currency the same way that the early United States had done. And he himself, of course, was assassinated not too long after that. Let's see. Garfield was opposed to private central banking. He was shot. William McKinley was opposed to private central banking. He was shot. And it just goes on and on and on. And now we're going to sort of zip up here a little bit faster to 1913, almost 100 years ago. This coming December 23rd will be the 100th birthday of the creation of the Federal Reserve. And this was basically to create a brand new private central bank. And this time they weren't going to call it the Third Bank of the United States, because they knew people would look back at that name and say, this is not a good thing. So they called it the Federal Reserve, to create the illusion that this was somehow part of the federal government, but it isn't. It's a privately owned central bank. Most of the owners are not even American citizens. It's no more federal than Federal Express. And on December 23rd, on the Christmas break, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was voted through Congress. Now, this was an unconstitutional maneuver, because Congress vests the money creation authority with the federal government, and the federal government cannot transfer that elsewhere absent a constitutional amendment, which they knew they were never going to get. So they passed the Federal Reserve Act. Woodrow Wilson signs it because he had promised the bankers he would sign the Federal Reserve Bill in exchange for their support for him to become president. And basically transferred the money creation authority of the government to this private central bank. Now, it's not an exclusive transfer. The U.S. government still has the authority to create their own currency. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Years later, in his diary, Woodrow Wilson wrote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." And then, of course, immediately after that, we got plunged into World War I. And you need to remember something very important. Before the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. And now we're well and truly into big mistake number 3. Yes. And it was all about knocking out an alternative financial system. Now, World War I actually started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. But the media in Great Britain and the United States focused on Germany because their industrial capacity and their banking system was an economic threat to Great Britain and to private central bankers. So, forget about Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. We got to get the Germans and smash them down. And in the Treaty of Versailles, following World War I, Germany agreed to go back to private central banks issuing all of the currency in Germany as a loan at interest, which led to the Weimar inflation where you had to have a whole basket full of paper notes to buy a loaf of bread. Then the Weimar Republic fell and the Nazis came to power, and the first thing they did was get rid of the private central bank and go back to a government-issued currency based on value. And the results were immediate. Germany's economy turned around. The transformation was so dramatic, it was called the German miracle. Even in the Western media, Time magazine made Hitler their man of the year in 1938 because of this amazing financial transformation he had done in Germany simply by kicking out the private central banks. And if you go back and you read the writings of Winston Churchill, you see that the rush to World War II was all about getting rid of this competing alternative economy, because nations with private central banks sucking out all the wealth for the bankers can't ever compete with nations that don't have private central banks, have an interest-free public currency. Let's see. Here's a quote from Winston Churchill in the Times, 1919. Should Germany merchandise, which was the word they used back there to do business, in the next 50 years, we have led World War I in vain. In a 1936 broadcast, Winston Churchill said, we will force this war upon Hitler if he wants it or not. And then again in 1936, speaking to U.S. General Robert E. Wood, Germany becomes too powerful, we have to crush it. And then in an autumn 1939 broadcast, Winston Churchill said, this war is an English war, and its goal is the destruction of Germany. Now, we have all been raised with, Pearl Harbor, and they were the bad guys. But it was very obvious financial interests were driving the rush to World War II. And a big stepping stone on that was the global boycott against the German economy and the banks in 1933, and the headlines proclaimed all over the world, Judea declares war on Germany, and they basically were trying to call for a global boycott on all German products and currency in order to destroy this economy. Because as it prospered, more and more people around the world were saying, why aren't we running our economy this way? It works for the nation. Why aren't we doing that? And of course, there is no real answer from the private central bankers, because private central bankers, they're thinking in terms of feudalism and serfdom, and we own you when you work for us all your time because you have to use our particular piece of ink and paper and pay interest on it. So basically that was what happened with World War II. And the bankers never ever quit. In 1933, we're in the middle of that decade's depression. I don't call it the Great Depression any longer because I think the current one is a lot worse. But in 1933, the Wall Street bankers and financiers who had bankrolled successful coups in Europe, like Brown Brothers Harriman in New York financed Hitler's rise to power because they knew they were going to eventually make money off the coming war. And these bankers in Wall Street got together and they literally planned a coup d'etat against Roosevelt because they didn't like his New Deal. They didn't like any deal that took money away from the rich to give to the poor, no matter how hungry the poor were struggling. The Wall Street bankers want a system where the money flows to them no matter what. They just sit there and the money rolls in, and they think that's the way the universe is supposed to be. So these bankers recruited a very famous gentleman, Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler. You may remember the name because he authored a treatise called All War is a Racket, which is very popular all over the internet and independent media these days. And the bankers recruited Butler because he was very popular with the military men, and they figured he could lead a military coup against Roosevelt. The military would follow him because of incredible popularity. Smedley Butler pretended to go along with this plan for a coup d'etat against Roosevelt until he had all the evidence he needed. Then he went to the White House and said, Roosevelt, you got a problem here. And Congress held hearings on this horrible idea that the Wall Street bankers were literally trying to overthrow the U.S. government, but they couldn't do anything because the bankers just kicked back and said, the instant you arrest any one of us, The rest of us will crash the economy all over again and destroy your New Deal, and we will make sure that you, Roosevelt, get the blame for it. So this was all hushed up. The hearing minutes in Congress weren't even declassified until 1964. Now, if you've ever seen a movie, there have been two versions now, called 7 Days in May. Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. Mm-hmm. And Lancaster is this military guy who's planning a coup against the president, and Kirk Douglas intervenes. It was based on the true story of the 1933 banker coup, but of course Hollywood, which has to do business with the banks to get financing for studios and cameras and so forth, took out the banker dimension. And Burt Lancaster was effectively playing the Smedley Butler character. They made him the villain just all on his own. So Hollywood didn't even tell you the true story about that. Now, let's zip up here a little more briefly to John F. Kennedy, because John F. Kennedy talked about this obvious plan to enslave the American people. He never mentioned it by name. He alluded to it. And he finally took action by ordering the Treasury Department to start issuing a new U.S. government-issued interest-free currency. It was called the United States Note. It looked almost identical to the Federal Reserve note, except up at the top where it said Federal Reserve, instead it said United States Note. This was a currency that did not accrue debt to private bankers. And Kennedy issued about $4.5 billion of that currency, which back in 1963 that was a lot of money. And it was a huge threat, because when that currency was being used by the American people, the bankers weren't getting their piece of the action of all American commerce. And 5 months after those United States notes went into circulation is when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. And on the Warren Commission sat John J. McCloy, president of the Chase Manhattan Bank, president of the World Bank. And I don't care how good a banker he is, he's clearly not qualified to be investigating the murder of the president. So presumably he was there to make sure that the financial dimensions of the assassination never came to light. Oh, it's just a crazed lone nut in the bookstore. That's all it was, really. Pay no attention. Of course, the United States notes were taken out of circulation and destroyed. There are still some surviving examples in collectors' hands. I have a couple of them myself. And it's just this gigantic scam, and these bankers will do whatever it takes, including killing presidents, to keep us enslaved to their scam. Now, I want to talk about something called Bretton Woods. I know I'm taking up a lot of time here, but I want to talk about something.
We've got time, Michael. Please, this is very valuable information.
You tell me to shut the heck up there. You.
Hello?
Hello. There.
Yes. Go ahead, Michael, please.
All right. At the end of World War II, Roosevelt's price to Winston Churchill for the U.S. to be drawn into the war against Nazi Germany through the back door of Japan was that the British pound, which at the time was the global trade and reserve currency, would surrender that role to the United States dollar. That's why the United States delayed so long entering the war. Churchill didn't want to give up that global currency. That was a big part of the wealth of the British Empire without having to actually do anything for it. But in the end, with the Nazis on the coast of Paris gazing at him avariciously, finally Churchill said, yes, we'll do that. So at the end of World War II, all of the major financial nations gathered at this luxury resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, and they hammered out the Bretton Woods Agreement. And this agreement committed all the nations to basically accept the dollar for all international trade and banking. If you were going to do business with another country, you would first convert your money to dollars, and then you would take those dollars, the other country, to buy your product. That country would then convert the dollars back to their own currency. And, of course, the Federal Reserve is getting a piece of the action and accruing interest all along the way. It's a huge financial advantage. Now, these other nations went along with Bretton Woods on two conditions. And the first was that the U.S. government would avoid overprinting the dollars with which to simply loot the other nations for manufactured goods and produce for a little more than the cost of ink and paper, and that the U.S. dollar would always be redeemable in gold for $35 an ounce. So far, so good. Well, the Federal Reserve, because it isn't actually part of the government and not under their control. Even Alan Greenspan was on videotape saying the Federal Reserve answers to no federal government authority. They started overprinting like crazy, and a lot of the post-war prosperity. Yes, we were a manufacturing titan, but there was also this idea that anybody could get these ink and paper tickets from the Federal Reserve and buy real raw materials, manufactured goods, agricultural produce in other countries, and those countries would have to accept those dollars at the value of $35 per ounce of gold. So we get to 1970, and the Bank of France is looking in their vaults, and they're saying a huge stack of this ink and paper stuff that has been given to France in exchange for wine and cheese and whatever else France was exporting. And France notifies the United States government under the terms of Bretton Woods they're going to send back all this ink and paper, and they want the gold equivalent for it at $35 an ounce. Richard Nixon looked at that pile of paper, realized the United States did not have anywhere near enough gold to redeem all that paper, and he ended gold convertibility. And basically said that's it. The dollar is delinked from gold, and we're sorry about that. It's an emergency measure to protect the strength of the U.S. dollar. And of course, it was not a temporary measure. It was permanent. The U.S. dollar has not been tied to gold since then. This also created a crisis for the dollar internationally. So what the U.S. government did in order to keep up demand for dollars, they went out and they implemented what was called the petrodollar policy, which was the United States went to all the oil-producing countries, primarily in the Middle East, and said, if you will agree to only accept U.S. dollars for your oil, we will provide your military security, especially against that annoying little country at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that's always throwing bombs and stuff at you. We will keep them under control. And the Arab oil nations did that. They got tons and tons of U.S. dollars for their oil. They sent those U.S. dollars back to the United States as investment, helping to prop up the economy, and, of course, buying American goods and products with which they build, and they're rather beautiful and amazing right now. Well, so here we are in the post-9/11 era, and Israel is throwing its weight around other countries, and these oil nations are beginning to realize the United States can't keep their end of the petrodollar deal. And so nations are starting to say, we're going to start selling our oil for currencies other than the dollar. This, of course, would collapse international demand for the dollar and destroy its value because it's not backed by anything else. And so in 2002, Saddam Hussein got United Nations permission to sell Iraq's oil for the euro. 1 year later, the United States invades, they lynch Saddam Hussein, and Iraq's oil is back on the global market, but only for U.S. dollars. Down in Libya, you have Gaddafi, who was everybody's buddy a few years ago, reformed terrorist, acknowledges Israel's right to exist, and then all of us that Libya is going to have a state central bank. And it's going to be issuing a new value-based currency, the gold dinar. And anybody who wants to buy Libya's oil must pay for it with the gold dinar. The U.S. invades, they kill Gaddafi, they throw out the state central bank. Nobody knows where the gold for the gold dinar went. They've got a brand new private central bank plunging the people into poverty. That's why that upset is over there. And Libya's oil is back on the global market, but only for U.S. dollars. That is the motive behind all this militarism we're seeing, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. It is attempting to reimpose Bretton Woods on the world. It's an attempt to reimpose the petrodollar deal on all the world's resource-rich areas by force of military arms. And unfortunately, in the long run, it's not going to work because countries are abandoning the dollar faster to invade them. Australia is now trading directly for the yuan with China. I'd like to see how the government's going to come up with an excuse to invade and conquer Australia. But China now has direct currency exchange deals with 8 different nations without going through the dollar. The yuan is far more popular than the dollar. It's already gone past the euro. It's in second place, closing on the U.S. dollar. And in Washington, D.C., we're hearing various politicians literally say the yuan is a mortal threat to the U.S. dollar. So no surprise, we're over there trying to rattle sabers over the Senkaku Islands with Japan and North and South Korea because the United States actually is insane enough to want to get us into a war with China. Not because we can conquer them or out of a fear they could conquer us, but because if a state of war exists between the United States and China, the first thing the U.S. can do is simply write off all that debt owed to China and say, well, we're at war, forget all that money we borrowed from you. And second, during a state of war, all of America's allies will be required to stop trading with the yuan and scurry back to using the U.S. dollar. So you can see how we got into this mess. And there's a lot more detail in the actual article, and there's a permanent link for it at the top of my page. But ever since I put this article out and the video got made, I have gotten a ton of email from people who are saying for the first time in their lives, all of U.S. history, the wars and assassinations and all of it makes perfect sense. Because up until now, we've been told the history of the United States is all about crazy, lone nut assassins, torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, all this other nonsense, surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, and it didn't make sense that we were always in some kind of a state of war or there were assassinations going on until you realize it's all driven by these private central bankers who will do anything to keep the world enslaved to this little Ponzi scheme that makes them rich and you poor. And we know it's not the only way you can run an economy because it's not the economy the United States started with.
That's right. And, these guys don't care how many soldiers or civilians get killed.
Michael,
yes.
I want to say to you that I have taken many, many, many political science, university political science courses, and in fact have taught political science courses, university courses, and international relations. Now, having said that, I want to tell you that what you have just said, and I have viewed the DVD as well, has taught me more than anything else, any of the zillions of books that I have read, than anything else. I want to say to you, Mike, that your very clear, concise presentation needs to be really, really pushed throughout this nation, really throughout the world, but definitely throughout this nation. You tie together so many aspects of, as you call it, the Ponzi scheme, because that's exactly what it is. It's a criminal Ponzi scheme. And I wanted to take the opportunity, frankly, Mike, to personally thank you and urge that you continue. Man, this is absolutely essential food for thought. So I just wanted to make that quick comment.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Coming from you and a person of your history and everything, that's quite an honor. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Boy, that is a lot to digest, but it's amazing how you gave the history of the United States in that talk, and the common thread is control through issuance of money on a debt-based system, and again, this piece, all wars are bankers' wars, is really a gem, and we have to continue to get it out to people, and the taking it that extra step, Mike, going from your article and your broadcast and putting that into a YouTube is really helped the rest of us get the word out, or sacrificed. You said the national debt, Mike. You hear that word all the time. People hear it and they don't really know what it is. It's basically what we owe these bankers, if I'm not mistaken. Go ahead.
Yeah, we owe the bankers. We certainly own the Federal Reserve. In fact, it's now estimated the Federal Reserve owns 1/3 of all the Treasury bills the U.S. government has ever issued. That gets these private central bankers control and influence over the federal government, which is supposed to be working for and listening to the American people. Now, the reason I say it's a Ponzi scheme, I'm not just using that as an insult or a pejorative. It's because of the way the system operates its debt trap. When you set up the private central bank and you convince the government to give you the authority to issue the public currency, all of that public currency enters circulation as a loan. When you are being paid by your employer, when you take that money to the store to buy your food, all during that time, you are using money that was loaned at interest. And the reason it is a trap is very simple. If I'm the private central bank and I loan $1 to the government, who then pays their workers, who then buys food, who then pays the farmer, who then pays the farm machinery company, and the dollar circulates around, and then the government taxes it, sends it back to the bank, and the bank says, wait a minute, you owe another 10 cents interest on that dollar. And the government said that 10 cents doesn't exist, and it never did. And that is something a lot of people need to understand. When the Federal Reserve says you, the government, meaning you, the taxpayer, the people of the United States of America, owe them so many trillions of dollars, that money never existed. And because more, when you loan that first pretty printed piece of paper into circulation, more money is owed to the bank than actually exists. That's the trap. It doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how much you sacrifice. You can never pay that debt off because by design, the debt always exceeds the available money supply until you reach the point where the debt threatens to crush the nation. And at that point, the government, rather than giving up their job for having screwed things up that badly, says, well, let's invade these other countries and take their wealth to make the payments on our national debt. But there's an issue, there's a question that people need to be thinking about, because they're already back to talking about the budget deal. It passed the House. There's some argument going on in the Senate, and they're still back and framed as, should we raise the debt ceiling or not? Should we or should we not? That's not the question. The question you, the listener, should be asking right now is not whether to raise the debt ceiling, but why it exists at all. You should be asking why the federal government, which is authorized by the Constitution to create and issue an interest-free money, instead borrows that money at interest from a privately owned central bank, plunging Americans and future generations of Americans into debt slavery to that bank. The Federal Reserve just creates it out of thin air. So can the federal government. The difference is a currency that serves the public interest versus a currency that serves the bankers. It's rule by bank, rule by compound interest, and it is no more legitimate a form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And all three of these systems only work because you have been brainwashed into thinking this is the way the world is supposed to be. And we know there are other better ways to run a nation's economy for that nation and its people. We need a public currency that is a public utility. We had one when the nation started. It was taken away from us 100 years ago this December 23rd.
That's right. And I myself, Michael, am a certified public accountant. I thousands of dollars on an education. I even got a master's degree in taxation. And we never learned this. You know, and it wasn't until somebody gave me a DVD back in 2006, I believe. It was Aaron Russo's Freedom to Fascism, and I just woke up. It's like watching a 9/11 truth video and realizing you've been snookered, you know, and watching the buildings blow up into dust and slapping yourself in the forehead saying I should have had a V8. But ever since then, I every year when I give my clients their tax returns, they also get a DVD about the Federal Reserve and Freedom to Fascism or one of Bill Still's films. He's got a new one out called Jekyll Island to mark the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve. But I don't believe the politicians are the answer, or electing somebody. I really think the answer's got to come from we the people, and that means educating enough of our fellows where they can't get away with this anymore. I often use the example, Larry's heard this 1,000 times, when you say to people, well, gee, what can we do about it? I tell them, just tell one other person like I told you. And I give the example of somebody who's coming into the neighborhood, maybe it's, some kind of scam artist, and he hustles the first house, but then that person calls the neighbor and say, look, this guy's coming around. You call the next neighbor, and before you know it, the whole neighborhood knows to look out for this guy, and he can't do it anymore, the scam artist. And I believe that can work for us. And with this new technology, the internet, the DVDs, the YouTubes, the ability to put on your own radio show and put the word out and have people listen, and then have it archived and spread it around through your Facebooks and all that, I think we really are making a change here, and we can prevail. But what do you think on that, Mike?
Well, I think probably you could summarize all of political history as a constant battle between the ordinary people knowing what's going on in the world and the ruling class trying to control what they know. And generally, over time, ruling classes try and constrain the awareness of their people. A good example of that, of course, is that prior to 1913, if you had been in public school in the United States of America, you would have learned about King George III's Currency Act, but after 1913 and the creation of the Federal Reserve, for some reason that was taken out of public school curriculum, and the American Revolution rebranded in terms of the tea tax and Stamp Act and all this other stuff, which really had nothing to do with it. The schools are there to teach you the information that will make you obedient believers of the status quo. Now, back when Gutenberg rediscovered movable type printing, it caused a tremendous social upheaval, because all of a sudden books were affordable by the middle class. Literacy exploded, and as a result, the balance between information control and information access shifted to the people. Now, those institutions that could adapt and evolve to meet the new reality did survive that period. Those institutions that couldn't collapsed. And we're seeing the same thing again now with the advent of the internet and the independent media. The balance of information control versus information availability is shifting to the people. The lies of the ruling bodies, whether they're civil or religious or financial, are being exposed. And those institutions that understand they can't play the game by the same rules that worked in the 1950s and 1960s are probably going to survive. And those institutions that can't adapt and evolve are probably going to collapse. And that, I think, includes the United States, which is carrying a 200-year accumulation of lies that must be maintained for the current population, whether it's John F. Kennedy, USS Maine, torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, Pearl Harbor. And right now, with the American people absolutely not trusting the U.S. government, I think it's only a matter of time before the United States follows the Soviet Union into history. And I think if we all just stay patient and calm, and I know it's difficult with all the abuse that's being heaped on us, but if we just sit back and let it happen, I really do think this government is going to crash, and the financial system is going to actually crash and take the U.S. government with it.
Yes, it sure seems that way, Michael. The short of it, you don't need to have a master's degree in finance or taxation or whatever to get this. It really is very simple. Mayor Rothschild of the global banking family, the Rothschilds, that are pretty much behind so much of these central banks, said in a quote many years ago, give me the ability to issue a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws. So that's why what I was referring to before we took the break, Mike and Larry, is that the change is not going to come from these politicians. It's got to come from us, and putting the pressure. And there is people power. We don't have the money, but we have the numbers. And I think that's why a big part of this Democrat, Republican, left, right, communist, conservative, all the name calling and the one side or the other, there's so much put into that to keep us, the people, divided. And we did have a caller join us, Mike, during the break, and it's someone that listens to quite a bit of the alternative radio, and her name is Renee, and it's Renee from North Carolina. And Renee and I are habitual listeners to the program in the morning, the Power Hour with Joyce Riley, who you've been on as a featured guest in the past. And I really like what Renee has to say as far as identifying how we're getting in the way of our own selves, and who needs to get get with the program and start putting we the people first. Renee, are you there with us?
Yes. The thing is, and you and I, are like minds. Like you said, you call me your tag team partner because we kind of collude on air because, you're given such a short time that sometimes, I will expand on your point or you'll expand on my point to drive the message, better. But the thing is, and we've both been very frustrated with Patriot Radio because they can't seem to organize around some of the most important points and drive the message home. They have their own agendas, prejudices, biases. They're often intellectually dishonest. Whatever their favorite ism is, they stress only the positive points, and whatever their hated ism is, they stress only the negative points, and that's intellectually dishonest, okay? And so, because you can use capitalism for good or evil, you can use communism for good or evil, and to get that fight going between those things, we waste so much time, because the problem is what Mike Rivero stressed, the banking. The problem is these criminals that have allowed this to go on for over 100 years. The problem is the fraud. The problem is all the money that has been stolen from us by government workers for over 100 years by allowing this to go on. And, and so many on Patriot Radio, they're like stuck in the past, like we're in the McCarthy era. It's those commies. It's like the enemy is within. I hear, these people call in, I heard they're crossing the border from Mexico. The Chinese are coming. Or, I heard there's Russian soldiers at the military base. You know what? With all the money we've thrown at the Pentagon, if those people are over here, I'm not mad at the Chinese or the Russians. I'm mad at our own people, the enemy within, who let them in here. And all those things are a diversion to get us off track. The problem is our own people within, because like I said, with all the money we've thrown at them, if we have an outside enemy, it's their fault. And so I find there's a lot of diversions even within the community that divide and prevent us from ever getting anywhere. And so I don't know if Michael has any ideas on this, but it's like, we need to be more effective, because we're in a race here with all the technology that they have and the way the cops just, and the military are like brainwashed and just following orders and beating up everybody and shooting their pets. It's like we're in a race against time. And, you know, some of these people, you know, it's like, you know, it maybe they're, you know, it's their business. But, you know, for some of us, this is not our business. It's not. We're not in the Patriot Radio business. And this is burning up our lives. We're not making money off of this. This is burning up our lives, spending time on all this stuff. They're burning up my time, your time on the planet where we could be doing more enjoyable things. They're literally stealing our lives. And the thing is, for this to just keep dragging on year for year, decade after decade, doesn't cut it with me. Like I say, we're getting ready to start a new year in 2014, and I want to see more effectiveness. Ask Mike if he has any ideas on this, because I'm frustrated with all this.
Well, obviously I do have a lot of ideas on this, and it isn't that the bankers are trying to steal our lives. They're harvesting us, because at that level of wealth, these money junkies don't see us as individual human beings deserving of dignity and respect. They see us as an asset or a resource to be harvested and plundered. And we're seeing that attitude infect the government as well, because they're telling us what foods we have to eat, GMO, what foods we can't eat, what medications we must take, what medications we're not allowed to take. We're not being treated like a population of citizens under the context of we the people. They're treating us like a herd of animals. You know, go out, work, give us your work product, breed new workers and soldiers for us. Here's what you're supposed to eat. Here's how you're going to live. And this is an attitude that seems to have infected the money junkies throughout history. In fact, Andrew Carnegie, who was a very wealthy man in history, and he started the Carnegie Educational Foundation, he openly said the ultra-rich are a completely different species of humanity, superior to the ordinary masses, and the ordinary masses are there for the ultra-rich to control and make money off of. And it was the Carnegie Foundation that started this idea of getting rid of a broad general education for the American people and focus on only teaching young people just the minimum they need to follow directions at work, fill out the paperwork, and not muddle up their head with all kinds of other exotic ideas that might get them thinking those double plus ungood thoughts. And so we're definitely seeing that. Now, the term I used before, money junkie, and it was a term, I used to call them money addicts, and then I heard Buffy St. Marie at a charity thing, and she called them money junkies, and I said, that actually captures the spirit of it. Because we know addicts destroy lives in society around them. We recognize it for the heroin addicts and the meth addicts, but for some reason there's a cultural blind spot to the money addicts. For some reason we're still lulled into thinking that we want to emulate them or at least admire and respect them. And I'll give you a good example, of course, would be Bernie Madoff. Co-founder of NASDAQ, had more money than he knew what to do with, and still had to go cheat his investors out of $65 billion with a Ponzi scheme. That's a money junkie, and we need to recognize that's an illness. That's a disease. Earlier this week, there was this bizarre court decision where this North Texas teenager had been drunk driving, killed 4 pedestrians, got away with probation because his defense attorney said, oh, he's suffering from affluenza. His parents are so rich, it distorted his set of social values. We shouldn't punish him for the life of luxury his parents gave him. And the judge bought it, or somebody bought the judge. I'm not exactly sure what.
Yeah, that's the problem.
They really do see themselves as a breed apart, and from that perspective, they can look down at all the hungry and homeless and say, let's just get rid of them. I don't want to have to spend money on them. And it's a way of denying their responsibility in setting up a system that by design created all this wealth, this poverty and unemployment and hunger and homelessness, and this blame the victim attitude, because they don't want to admit to themselves they're the problem. I remember what Lloyd Blankfein over at Goldman Sachs was saying. He's doing God's work at the point where Goldman Sachs was taking all these homes away from people. Lloyd Blankfein literally got out and said, I'm doing God's work, really. And apparently he believes that.
Oh, yeah, they convince themselves of their own life. You see, I learned this a long time ago from Scott Peck and People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil. See, people, they want to commit the evil, but they don't want to have to suffer the pain of legitimate guilt. So that's what all this rationalization and line is about. And I agree with you to a point, but I also disagree with you, and here's why. Yes, we're always going to have criminals like Bernie Madoff and Karzai, but you know what? There was a guy, Harry Markopoulos, who wrote No One Would Listen, I have the book, where he went to the SEC repeatedly about Bernie Madoff. So you see, the people, to me, when I trace it down, the people I most blame for the situation we're in, yes, those people are criminals, but we pay people. We have government employees that we have just said, look, we'll give you a portion of our income and you take care of this job. It is the government employees' failure, which is why we're in the situation we are in, okay? I blame them more than the crooks. It is the collusion of the hypocrites and frauds that pretend they're law enforcement and good guys who collude with, look the other way, and let this go on. They, to me, are worse than the actual criminals. And like I say, to me, the branch most guilty, okay, in other words, is all law enforcement, the judicial branch of government, all the agencies, law enforcement, everything. If those people were honest, our executive branch would have to be honest. Our legislative branches would have to be honest, out of fear of being prosecuted. So yes. The thing is, the fault lies for all that we have wrong is the failure and corruption within our legal system and law enforcement that allows all this mess to continue. It's their fault more than the money junkies.
Well, I'd like to insert a comment there. First of all, when this nation was started, the idea was the government was going to stand in the middle, be an arbiter, an umpire, if you will, between the needs of the general population and the nation and the inevitable greed of the ultra-rich, because that is a constant throughout history. Money's an addiction. Once you have a certain amount of it, you just rules. And government's function, as defined by the Constitution of the United States, was to stand as an arbitrator between the desires of corporate rich interests and the needs of the people. Unfortunately, when government starts to align itself with the financial interests, that's fascism. Mm-hmm. That's according to Mussolini, who was the Olympic gold medal winner in Fascist Jerk. And that's where we are. And you're talking about everybody going around screaming, the commies, the commies, the commies. The people who are doing that are trying to take us back to the Cold War hysteria of the 1950s and 1960s. But our problem isn't communism. Occupy Wall Street doesn't want communism. The only people standing up with signs for communism are the ones hired by the public relations firms to wave those signs in front of the media cameras. Our problem is that as capitalism has become unstable and unbalanced, driven by this private central banking model, it inevitably has become fascistic. And interestingly enough, Vladimir Lenin predicted that would be the end of American capitalism, is it would go fascistic. Now, can I share some definitions for you when we talk about capitalism, fascism, and communism? I'd like to share my definitions with you. Capitalism is a system under which if you make money, you get to pay. If you lose money, you are responsible for that debt for the rest of your life, because freedom means not only the freedom to succeed, it means the freedom to fail, the responsibility to accept the consequences of either outcome. Now, under socialism, if you make money, it's taxed away from you to better society. If you lose money, society is taxed to cover the losses so you can try again. That's socialism. Under fascism, if you make money, you're allowed to keep it, as long as you're giving the politicians a piece of the action. When you lose money, society is taxed to cover the losses. And after all these bailouts and TARP and the rest of it, of simply looting the public to cover all these Wall Street losses, it is clear we are a hardcore fascist economic dictatorship.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you. Like, the thing is, like I said, so many in Patriot Radio, because you don't have to listen to any of the programs for very long. You go through so many of these old-timers that are, I call them Liber-Publicans, because they're still carrying a lot of Republican baggage in their thought processes. And the thing is, they still are carrying that whole thing. You know, they understand that the whole, the war on terror is wrong, but for some reason I have noticed when they go, oh, yeah, it's phony, don't pay attention to that. But recently, in the last few months, they have reverted back to the whole communist thing, which is just as phony as Smedley Butler pointed out. It's that whole thing to divide and conquer and point us toward a boogeyman that's outward instead of inward. And the thing is, I've noticed there are many of them that just go on and on about the socialism and the commies, and you know, the thing is, and this, I'm with you. I am with you. It's fascism, you know, but that's not what most people are saying.
Renee, the reason we're starting to see a revival of the old McCarthyism, commie bashing, is because the U.S. war agenda is driven by a desire to force the entire world back onto the post-World War II Bretton Woods agreement, where the dollar is the global trade and reserve currency, and the petrodollar deal, where all natural resources are traded for the U.S. dollar. But for that policy to work, it must be an all-or-nothing deal, and that means eventual war with Russia and China. And so all this bashing about the communists and the evils, and they're already starting the propaganda run-up to sell a war with Russia to the United States people. That's why it's not just a distraction. They're already pre-selling. Ooh, the Chinese are bad, the Russians are bad, they're commies, we've got to go after them. They're trying to revive that whole red baiting, ready to go to war mentality of the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah, but it's not it's not Rush Limbaugh doing it. It is libertarian patriot radio hosts doing it. Is the point I'm trying to make.
And that's
why who's doing it.
And that's why, Renee, excuse me, but that's why what you do by listening and calling in and speaking up, and what Larry and I do as far as being watchdogs for the phony left and the phony anti-war movement is so important. You know, we've got to speak up when something's going offline there. And speaking of on the line, off the line, we've had other callers in the queue. And
I'm sorry.
That's all right. You didn't know. But right where you and Michael were leaving off, I think might be a good time to play the clip. We asked Dave Corso to queue up, and we got this out of the post on Michael's website, whatreallyhappened.com, the All Wars Are Bankers Wars post. He included this 1 minute and 43 second clip from the Hollywood movie that came out in 2009, The International, great film. It's called The Essence of the Banking Industry is the name of this YouTube, and it gets right back to the wars. You know, why do we have these wars, and what do they have to do with the banks? And then you were talking, here we are, we're getting the propaganda again, we're getting people scared, so they retreat to what Larry and I called their respective reservations. You know, when people are wandering off and they're starting to think for themselves, and you know, maybe I can think for myself now, and then you get all scared and you go back to what you know. The left go back to the left and the right go back to the right, and I think that's what we're seeing now. But Dave Corso, if you do have the clip ready, this might be a good time, and then we might go to the next caller. Thank you, Renee.
But why is the bank committing so much of its capital and resources to the sale of these missiles?
It's a test. Small arms are the only weapons used in 99% of the world's conflicts. And no one has the capacity to manufacture them faster and cheaper than China. What Scarson is attempting to do is to make the IBBC the exclusive broker of Chinese small arms to the Third World. And the missile deal is the gateway transaction.
Yeah, but billions of dollars invested simply to be a broker. There can't be that much profit for them.
No, this is not about making profit from weapon sales. It's about control.
Control the flow of weapons, control the conflict.
No. The IBBC is a bank. Their objective isn't to control the conflict. It's to control the debt that the conflict produces. You see, the real value of a conflict, the true value, is in the debt that it creates. You control the debt, you control everything. You find this upsetting, yes? But this is the very essence of the banking industry. To make us all, whether we be nations or individuals, slaves to debt.
And I'd like to add a quick comment, if you don't mind. The movie was called The Independent, and the character who was speaking about the true nature of banking shortly after in the storyline, he is assassinated. But it is absolutely true. Wars are the bankers' richest harvest. Bankers love war. They don't even care which side wins or loses, because both sides go into debt to fight the war, and both sides go further into debt to rebuild after the war. And so when this whole horrid mess is over, the ordinary people sort of kind of have what they had before, except the graveyards are a lot bigger, but they're in debt to the banks for the next 50 to 100 years. Germany only paid off its debt from World War I about 5 years ago. And that's really what it's all about starting a war to plunge a nation into debt, and it's a 3-step process. And it directly relates to private central banks like the Federal Reserve. You set up this private central bank, all of the currency in circulation is accruing interest to the bank, the debt piles up until the public, aware of their debt, stops new borrowing, starts to pay down the debt. Well, that, of course, would collapse the pyramid. It's at this point the Keynesian economists come in and demand the government start borrowing on behalf of the people, and I might add, without their permission. And that's where, as the private economy starts to decline, the government economy starts to borrow and spend until you reach a point where the people won't borrow anymore and the government can't borrow anymore, which is where we are here in the United States. And at that point, they kick off the war, because once there's a war, all the restraints on borrowing come off. The government has to borrow more to fight the war. The people have to agree to more debt to pay for the war. And that's why we're in this situation. The United States has a history of allowing the financial system to reach the point of collapse and getting into a world war to get out of it. Crash of 1907, solve it with World War I. Crash of 1929, solve it with World War II. Crash of 2008, and already the United States has invaded over 10 countries on 2 continents. Technically, it's already a world war. We're just waiting for the really big bang so that everybody says, oh yes, it's a world war, and we're off and running again.
And the way it works here in the Congress, every year there's a defense budget bill, and it's coming up again, and it's a great piece of legislation to throw in whatever the heck you want to get passed that wouldn't get passed otherwise. For instance, the indefinite detention provisions of the NDAA 2012 that was passed New Year's Eve 2011. And here we are again. You know, if you question the funding at all, you know, they come right back at you and say, what? You're not going to support our troops. You're not going to give them the equipment and the means they need to defend our freedoms. You know, it's the same old thing. And, you know, there's these certain mechanisms that are used on the people that after a while we got to stop taking that bait. You know, you go back to Nazi Reich Marshal Hermann Goering. I believe it was at the Nuremberg war crimes tribunals where he said that you could take any country to war. That's easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the peacemakers as being unpatriotic. And man, have we seen that played out for the past 12 years. But I think we did have another caller.
Hello, audience, and hi, Phil and Larry. And hello, Michael. I really got an education here, Mike, and I want to thank you. I thought I'd be too tired to sit up and listen because I worked all weekend, and I was pretty exhausted, but I found that I was waking up more and more as I was listening because it's so interesting, and you truly know your history, and I'm all about learning, and I've always loved his history, and this has just given me more education, which thank you so much for being a guest tonight. I must say that my dad, Phil knows the story, but my dad was a public accountant. He was not a CPA, but he used to sit up late at night and talk to me. We had a lot of good talks, and he was always drinking his beer, but nevertheless, he and I had good talks, but I'm talking way back 30, 40 years ago, and he said to me, it must have been 35 years ago or so, Kath, you don't know this, but I'm going to tell you, the Federal Reserve is worse than the mafia, and it is no part of the government. It has nothing to do with the federal government. I remember distinctly him telling me that, and I remember thinking to myself, this is too boring. Economics and such were always boring to me, and I guess it was because I could never figure it out. I've never been really good with numbers. And so I thought, man, how boring. So I changed the subject. But it kind of stuck in my head. And here now all this, has come out about the Federal Reserve with the activists. And your information especially, I've listened to, Phil had a DVD, I think it's all wars or bankers' wars that I was listening to. And but tonight, listening to you, it was just really an eye-opener for me. And I'm an anti-war person, always have been. And I just have to say, I work with the masses. I work with your everyday Joes when I'm in the workforce. I'm in healthcare. And it's too bad that these people can't hear this message. I really think, they're caught up being slaves to the system. I work with a lot of young single moms, and they're working 2 jobs just to survive, and they really, sometimes I'll talk a little bit about some of this stuff, and they perk up their ears. I'm kind of amazed, but they do. And I think if they only had access to some of this information, it would be really interesting. I think we'd have a lot more activists out there. I don't listen to talk radio. I listen to Phil's show and Larry's show, obviously. But I'm not one that sits around and listens. I'm not on the computer much. I like to be on the go, and so I'm not listening to a lot of, I never watch TV. I haven't for 40 years. And so I don't hear this talk radio like Phil does and Renee does. And I don't have my finger on the pulse of everything, but I have to say, you as a guest tonight have really been something. I just wanted to call in to thank you, because it has made a difference with me.
You're very, very welcome. And I would share with you that we are at a stage right now where the majority of Americans are now awake and they're starting to pay attention. We're even seeing the corporate media start to reach out to the independent media for information and stories, and we're seeing the horrible poll numbers, support for Congress, 6%. They're still trying to fudge the polls for Obama that sort of kind of maybe a little less than half of America still support and believe in him. But if you do your own polling, you find out that's not true. One of the biggest lies that you are being sold right now is that if you are upset with the way things are going, that you're a tiny minority and you really ought to stay quiet. But of course, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. And if you just go out and you start talking to people and you want to basically pay attention to the people who are clearly ready to listen to what's going on, don't waste your time arguing with people who just want to argue back with you. Half of them are undercover informants anyway. But if you start talking to your friends and your neighbors and coworkers, you're going to find out a lot more people are plugged into what's going on. And even more importantly, when you speak out, you're going to give others around you the courage to speak out. And the reaction you will get from a lot of them is, you too, I thought I was the only one who was seeing
Yes.
Oh, that's pretty true. I found that to be true. And I'd say more and more in the past couple of years. So I agree that that's happening.
Well, Kathy, and please don't leave us unless I don't know if there's any other folks in the queue, Dave. If so, please let me know. But Larry and I were talking about this. Again, I mentioned earlier, we have our half-hour monthly show with UnitedWeStrike.com's monthly marathon, and Michael Rivero has participated in that as well. But we were talking about this on our program Saturday, where, the people are waking up and they're seeing the same problem and they're seeing the same culprit, but still we haven't gone that next step of actually putting aside all the other differences that we have, and real differences. People are on the left because they see different issues in the way that the left sees it, and vice versa with the right. There are a number of issues that we can greatly disagree on. And what happens, and Larry can speak more on this, as well as Kathy, we're unable to physically come together, and it's very, very difficult. And Kathy and I are both activists here in the Daytona Beach area, Michael, and we've been, coordinators or leaders, if you will, in the anti-war organizations here since 2004, 2005, but in recent years we've been going to the Occupy, the Tea Party, the 9/12s, of course we've always been about Campaign for Liberty. That's right. Thank you, Kathy. We were actually members of that group, and we see this. We see that, go to both groups and hear them saying the same thing, but gee, you try to get them to physically come together. It's difficult. But Larry, you've seen this, but it's the only way we're going to bring people together is to bring people together,
Right.
And I think you talked about Occupy Wall Street earlier, Michael, when Renee was on the line, and Kathy and I, we went to the first meeting here in Daytona Beach when they had theirs, and what was that, October 2011, and, cause we were concerned that it wouldn't be co-opted by the Democrats and the left, as we had already been through that with the anti-war movement. And, I remember there was a video that just went viral. It was this fella, Ron Paul supporter at the Occupy Wall Street in New York, and I think if you type in on your YouTube search, best rant at Occupy Wall Street, and he was saying end the Fed and everything, but he was talking about what Ron Paul was talking about, and there was whether it was spoken or unspoken, watch out for these Ron Paul people. Was the vibe in the Occupy, and it's a shame that they couldn't bridge that gap. Larry and I were invited on to UnitedWeStrike.com in November of 2011. That's before we hooked up to start our own program, and Karen Tedesco and Charles Irwin had us on, and Larry, we were talking about this the other day, what we were concerned about at that time happening, and did you want to pick it up there and jump in?
I think the bottom line is that we need to do precisely what Mike Rivero has been saying. Mike has said repeatedly to where we need to, you say it too, Phil, follow the damn money trail, people. Pay attention. Follow what the economics is about. Follow, do look behind the curtain. Contrary to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Pay all attention to the man behind the curtain, because that sucker is blood-sucking all of us. And I really like the word that Mike, you used, Mike, when you said it's about harvesting us. And when you really think about it, that's exactly what it's about. So one of the ways of harvesting us, keeping us on the plantation/reservation, all of us, black, white, brown, red, yellow, all of us, is to keep us under control. And how do you keep us under control? You keep us divided and distracted. We don't pay attention to all the bankers, the private central banks. How many Americans, for that matter, are even cognizant of the fact that the Fed, i.e. the Fed, what a joke, what a misnomer, okay? But that the Federal Reserve is not federal. I love the part where Mike says in the DVD, and said it tonight, they're no more federal than Federal Express. But how many Americans really are cognizant of that, okay? It's beginning to increase the awareness, but we've got so much more to do. And I don't give a damn whether it's the so-called left or the so-called right. Anyone who is not willing to bury their differences in favor of our common interests so that we stop being harvested, anyone who's not willing to do that really needs to get the hell away and let the people do what the people need to do, which is to come together, understand who's screwing us and how they're doing it. And Mike, you've explained it so well on this program, and of course on the DVD as well, and I'm sure other places. This weekend I'm going to be on a so-called right-wing show, but my message won't change. And next weekend I'm going to be on a so-called left-wing show, but my message will not change. Okay? So I just can't thank you enough, Mike. I just can't thank you enough. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I'd like to insert a comment here. A lot of the divisions we're seeing are intentionally created to keep us divided against each other. Have you ever noticed every time the election is coming up, they stop talking about the economy and the wars, and all of a sudden, gay marriage is the big issue, or abortion is the issue. These are issues that are put up there to keep us divided and arguing with each other, so we're not really paying attention to the important issues that affect all of us, which includes the economy and the wars. And right now, I think we need to be very concerned. I think the Occupy movement really did scare the government. Now, they spent a huge amount of resources infiltrating the movement, putting in people who would do things that would embarrass the movement in front of the media. It's the same stuff Larry will tell you they were doing back in COINTELPRO. I think we're at the point right now where this government would really welcome if the American people could somehow be turned against each other, even to a violent level. And I remember back when everybody was waiting for the George Zimmerman verdict in the Trayvon Martin case, and the whole week before then, the corporate media was saying, oh, there's going to be riots, there'll be riots. They were selling us the idea that if George Zimmerman was acquitted, that everybody ought to get out there and riot. Fortunately, the black people and the white people were too smart to fall for that. They picked up on that's what the government wanted, because then they can have a national emergency and they can get the police out there, and all these protesters could be driven away. Same thing, I think, with Adam Kokesh's aborted armed march into Washington, D.C. on July 4th. I think our government is so afraid of the American people right now that they need something dramatic to reassert their control. And I would not look at an absence of physical gathering as an indication that we're not being effective, because this revolution is taking place in the virtual world and along the communication. And so the fact that people don't physically show up unless it is something like an Occupy Wall Street doesn't mean they're not listening, doesn't mean they're not paying attention, doesn't mean they don't care. It's just they're plugged into that cyberspace. And this is where this revolution really is being fought and will be won.
That's very true. And I hope Kathy's still with us, because the Trayvon Martin thing is right here in our backyard, Central Florida. And Kathy works in the healthcare, where a lot of the folks working there are African American. And Daytona Beach itself, there's quite a large percentage of the population in the city is black. And Kathy, are you still with us?
I'm with you, and I'm thinking back to that time. And actually, the Afro-Americans I work with were divided. There were the most vocal person in the group was actually white. She was a free thinker. She is a free thinker. And she, a critical thinker, and I didn't get involved in the conversation. I can't, because I'm a supervisor, so I don't get involved in the staff's conversations as they're talking to each other while they're waiting to pass trays or whatever. But she was very vocal, and she said, "You know what? What was he doing in that neighborhood anyway? He should never have been there." And she was more or less stating that, you know, she was going to go along with whatever the jury decide. It's the way the country is. We set up our legal system this way for a jury of peers to decide after they've heard all of the evidence. And she was telling her coworkers, "We don't know all the evidence. We only hear what we see on TV." And she said, "We do not have access to all the evidence." But she was questioning why some of the Afro-American people in the neighborhood were getting so riled up. And there were some that were. I personally had an experience with one that wanted to leave early to go to a gathering, not a riot, but a gathering against the verdict. But anyway, it was an interesting time, and I could get the vibe that they were trying to divide again.
Yes.
Divide between the whites and that was ridiculous. It never happened.
But it sounds, the way you were describing it to me, Kathy, it sounds like a lot of the black community realized what was going on, that there were outside influences trying to stir it up, and they were hip to it, you know, and it didn't work. It didn't work.
It flopped. It really failed because they were hip to it, and they don't, in the first place, a lot like the Native Americans, they don't believe everything the white man says on the tube. They just don't. So that I found out. And I know from being up north with the Native Americans, they're the same way. So they just don't swallow everything they hear from the white people on TV.
Yeah, I wanted to put in a comment here because I think the current skepticism of the corporate media basically crosses all cultural lines right now. The audience numbers for the corporate media are very much in decline. Their advertising revenues are very much in decline. And polls are showing the majority of Americans are now getting their political news off the independent media, off of the internet. And right now, the corporate media and the government have lost control over what Americans are thinking. Right now, where we're sitting, this is the high ground in the war for the minds of America, and our numbers are improving, their numbers are going down. I think this is why we're seeing, in a positive light, more of an outreach by the corporate media to try and encompass and bring in some of the independent media views. On the negative side, of course, we found out this last week, Obama has directed Media Matters to go after the independent media the way they just recently went after Fox. There's apparently this big meeting down in Peru with representatives of 11 nations, how they can regain control of the Internet. Because if you remember the history of the Internet, it was never supposed to be made public. It was developed by the Department of Advanced Research Projects Agency as a private, non-censorable, non-breakable communication for government agencies, military contractors, and the universities doing research for them. And over time, it began to sort of go private as people who had access to the Internet left those government institutions and contracts, went into the private sector, and took net connections with them. Then in the 1970s, the government tried to regain control by saying, here's your check for running the backbone, but we're going to change the rules who's allowed to use this. And all the companies that were then running the backbone for the ARPANET said, you can keep your check, We will carry the cost from here on. And that was when the ARPANET became the Internet. In hacker lore, it's called the Great Revolt. But the government never intended this technology to be in the hands of ordinary citizens, and they've been trying to figure out some way to regain control of it ever since.
Larry, sorry for keep hogging the airtime here, but one of the things that Kathy and I have gone through over the years of being activists here in East Central Florida, Michael, is trying to reach people, trying to be heard, and you come to find that you reach people, meet people where they're at, is the saying. Meet them where they're at. And I have an example here, and it goes back to the Federal Reserve, and the private central banking and how that ties with wars and being enslaved by debt. And there was a great, you find it on YouTube, a great explanation done by this TV preacher named Rod Parsley, and it's called Conquering the Spirit of Debt. I believe it was from 2003. It's about 45 minutes as well, similar length to your All Wars Are Bankers' Wars. And it is one of the best presentations I've ever seen explaining the creation of the Federal Reserve and how the transfer of wealth happens under this issuance of money for interest, and how it relates to the wars. And the thing was, Kathy, if you recall, when I brought it down to the corner with our anti-war folks that we've stood shoulder to shoulder with for years, right? Right. And I said, hey man, you got to take a look at this. And they said, Rod Parsley, he's a right-wing fascist preacher. I'm not going to look at that. So they missed the message, Mike. They missed the lesson because he's a righty. You see?
That was a shame, because that is a really good presentation.
Right.
And anybody would understand it, too. He speaks in, in the language that everybody can understand.
What it illustrates is, their stubbornness, stubborn loyalty to their left, and the problem, those evil righties, outweighed my friendship and credibility with them. A guy who stood shoulder to shoulder with them for years, saying, hey man, you really need to take a look at this. And that was trumped by this. That's one of those evil righties, I mean, it really is so deep. So what we've done, I've been able to give, one of my next door neighbors, was very, conservative Christian, Republican. And that was the disc that I gave her. Because when it said Rod Parsley, her eyes lit up, because that's one of the conservative Christians, and she watched it. And because she watched it, we broke through. She woke up, and now she knows about chemtrails and 9/11 and all the other stuff, And she actually hands out some of the DVDs for us. So,
she sure does.
Well, anyway, my God, we're coming up towards the end of the show. Larry, I know I've hogged a lot of the airtime tonight, and is there anything you'd like to say, Larry?
Well, I want to say that I think it's not necessarily loyalty to, and you know that you and I are definitely in agreement. I just want to amend the statement. I simply want to say that with the loyalty of these people, many of them, is actually is what I call loyalty to the plantation, loyalty to the reservation in a psychological sense, okay? And that's what I think we need to hone in on. To be loyal to the people, the struggle, ordinary, everyday, black, white, brown, red, and yellow people. And I think that's why the so-called mainstream, I call corporate stream media, the corporate media, is terrified. The fact is that they are terrified. And I think Mike alluded to that himself. And so we need to I think, intensify. We need to look for every possibility to be creative. And that's how we will win this struggle, or at least move this struggle forward for everyday ordinary people, irrespective of their color, their gender, etc. And I also just want to quickly say that as far as the people waking up, I do think it's across the board. I don't think it's just, black people or white people, or I think people across the board, thank goodness, are saying, wait a minute, this is crap. This is crap, all right? I know, I can't trust it. It's sort of like how people laughed in the former Soviet Union when Pravda would come out with things. People would joke about it because they knew it was absolute nonsense, okay? And I think that's what's happening today with the U.S. corporate stream media, the same thing. So that's all I wanted to say. Quickly thanking Mike Rivero again, thanking Dave Corso, thanking our audience.
Thank you, Larry. Kathy, before we sign off, is there anything that you'd like to finish up with?
Well, I just wanted to say thanks to Mike again, because it's just been a great show. Thank you, Larry and Phil. And this was one of the best shows, I think. I mean, I got a real education here. So thank you so much.
Oh, good, and we want to thank you for participating. Michael, any closing thoughts from you, Michael, or suggestions, references?
Just the comment that I mentioned before, which is when you have the courage to speak out, you will give others around you the courage to speak out, and that's how we're going to build a consensus of what's going on. There is a transformation taking place in this country. It's terrifying to the government. It's terrifying to the money junkies. And at this point, I really don't think it can be stopped. I'm concerned the government is trying, or considering trying something dramatic to reverse the flow. But in the long run, I don't think they're going to do it. Definitely violence. I think if we just stay patient and calm, the system is tearing itself apart. What we need to be thinking about is the blueprint for the new America, what kind of country we want here to replace the one that we have now. Obviously, no private central bank, return to the Constitution, a bunch of other things. It's a subject for another show.
Oh, great. Well, we sure do appreciate having you on this month, Michael, and hopefully we can do it again sometime. Larry, do you want to mention your website and what's where folks can see your work?
Okay, well, thanks, Phil. I appreciate that. Yes, I want to thank our audience again and our special guest, Mike Rivero, and our brother and hard worker, Dave Corso. Yes, you can find my works by me, Larry Pinkney, at IntrepidReport.com, IntrepidReport.com, where I'm an associate editor. You can also go to Black Activist WG. That's blackactivistwg.org, where you will see a compilation of many, many years of work from 1968 onward, right to the present, 2013. So, and of course, for those who may recall, I am a former editorial board member and columnist with Black Commentator, blackcommentator.com, and I say I'm former. Be clear about that. Editorial board member and columnist, but you can still find a great deal of my articles on blackcommentator.com. But remember, IntrepidReport.com, blackactivistwg.org. Again, thank you so much. Thank our audience. We love you. Stay strong. La lucha continua. The struggle continues. All power to the people.
I cannot be silent.
Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Everyone must play a part. Everyone got to go to work. Work for peace. Spirit say work.
I cannot be silent.